Hello, and thank you for coming to our demo. We are a 5-member team in Mod 3 of the backend program. Today, we'd like to introduce to you DownDraft, our app to help you find the perfect beer for your next adventure. The purpose and the core demo for our app is anyone looking for a unique and interesting way to discover new beers, and someone interested in using a more scientific way to choose among the new beer options. With that, we'd like to take you into our application and demonstrate its functionality. All right, going to use Google third-party authentication to sign in, which will then take you to the app's dashboard. And I'd like to hand it off to Claudia to explain more.
So when a user is signed in, they land on this dashboard/homepage, and they will see their name as well as the 3-day forecast for their default location. So we get the 3-day forecast with the high and low temperatures, as well as a little description. We can also see a search bar to search for beers by name. So we could go ahead and type in Coors, and we will be brought to a table with all the beers in our database that have Coors in it. In the upper right-hand corner, we will also see our navigation bar. So if we open that up, we see the Google OAuth avatar. We see a button to go home, which is the dashboard. We see a button for a new trip, scheduled trips, and logged out. So if we go to new trip, we can make a new trip. We could go ahead and call this trip going to the mountains. We can enter a zip code. We could just use my zip code of 80204, and we can make it for tomorrow. And at this point, we could say, let's go, and we will be forwarded to these beers, and I'll hand it off to Logan now.
Thanks, Claudia. So if you're thinking this page looks a little familiar, you're right. But you'll notice that the key difference is when you come from the route of creating a brand new trip rather than searching for beers, the table looks a little bit different. So coming from creating a new trip, our program actually filters out beers based on the criteria you've set with the weather and elevation based on your trip, and it recommends you a list of potential beers that you can add to that trip. So now if Joe would like to show us that functionality, adding a beer to a trip will then route you to the information page on that trip, and you can see the trip's name, the zip code of where you're going, the date that you've planned the trip for. We also included the elevation and temperatures that we're filtering the beers by, because we thought, scientific-minded people who would enjoy using this app probably want to see the data that is helping to select their beer recommendations. You can also see the beer that you've chosen for the trip, which is nice for when you want to go to the store later and buy it on your way. So then if you have scheduled multiple trips, we can actually take you to an index page via the scheduled trips route. And there's an option to click on any one of these trips to see the information for the trip you've already planned, or if you want, you can just look right at this page and get the quick overview. And now I will hand this off to Joey, who will explain our data consumption.
So within this application, we built a service architecture. So the front end is being fed data from the back end exclusively, and the front end only holds a little bit of information on the user. We use the Open Weather API. The elevation API is called Open Topo, and we have scraped data from the Open Beer database. These are all stored within our backend and served using Rails APIs. We use primarily RESTful routes, but we do have a few in there that return core data in the form of fast JSON API serializers that the front end consumes. It's a pretty lean exercise, and the front end is able to access all of that data without having to store anything locally. I'll now pass it to Galen to go over a little bit how we do that beer selection.
So once we have a trip created with the weather and elevation determined, Our backend makes an active record query and filters out the beers according to their style, depending on the max temperature for the trip date. And we've used this sorting method that our team came up with, depending on whether it's in a hot, warm, cool, or cold category. After that, we filter by ABV, depending on the elevation of your destination. As the elevation increases, ABV should decrease. And then we also randomize the selection of beers whenever the page is refreshed, so the user gets a new selection of beers. And then these are our endpoints. Just some things to note is that the post request for getting a new trip takes in the parameters that the user's filled out, along with that user's ID to connect that trip to that user. And then for getting the beer suggestions, we take in the trip ID to get the information from that trip. And this concludes our presentation of DownDraft. Thank you for coming, and feel free to ask us any questions.